It's a sad day. Long gone are the times when you could throw a rock on YouTube without hitting a Beatles analysis video. As much as I love these videos, it's safe to say the Beatles have been analyzed to death. Or have they? The answer is still probably yes, but I'm gonna try another approach today. I want to explore if and or how their chord progressions evolved over time as they gained experience. So I've identified 3 categories of chord progressions, and I'm gonna pick 2 songs in each to see if their writing did develop, and I'll try to avoid using the super duper famous songs as much as possible. The first category is rock and roll songs. Look, I know they're a rock band, so 95% of their songs could be called rock songs, but I'm specifically talking about the ones that sound like they're coming out of the tradition of Chuck Berry and Little Richard. So these songs are usually a variation on the 12-bar blues. They often rely heavily on dominant chords on the 1, 4, and 5. A good example is I Saw Her Standing There, but there are some key differences. Though it's not a 12-bar blues, you can definitely hear the influence. The 1, 4, 5 are all there. They're played as dominant chords, but the chords don't appear in the same order as a 12-bar blues progression because it's a modified AABA. Also atypical of the 12-bar blues are inverted chords and a flat 6 chord. So they continued to mess around with the rock form and tradition on songs like Dr. Robert. Dr. Roberts' connection to early rock song is less obvious, but I still hear it. It uses a lot of dominant chords, though not on the 1, 4, and 5, and it also has a 3-phrase structure like a 12-bar blues. But this is clearly an evolution on the basic rock formula. The main evolution that I hear is that these chords in particular feel like new key areas rather than chords within a progression. This is because of how long each chord lasts and how distantly related they are in terms of tonality, and also because the vocal phrases are very different from one another. Of course, the Beatles have many straight-up rock songs, but you can see that even on their first album, they were already expanding upon that tradition, and they continue to do so throughout their entire discography, except on Let It Be, because the whole point of that was to get back to the roots. And now for something completely different. Now this category of songs John Lennon would call granny music, but the more polite way of describing it would be inspired by jazz or show tunes. The first song that I'll talk about is Do You Want to Know a Secret? So in the end, the joke's on John Lennon because he wrote this one. Most granny songs are actually Paul's, and this one rarely gets included in that category, but I see it as the tiniest seed of what would come later. Here's why. It is inspired by a show tune called I'm Wishing from Disney's Snow White.
Want to know a secret? Promise not to tell?
It has some strong connections to jazz. The A sections are based on the 2-5-1 progression, a core building block of any jazz chord progression. The 2-5-1 is embellished with this descending chromatic chord pattern, also very common in jazz, and melodically has much more to do with jazz standards than any rock and roll song I've heard. Of course, the instrumentation has very little to do with what we call granny music, but surely you'll agree that the next song reeks of granny perfume, and it's Honey Pie. Here is incontrovertible proof of Honey Pie's unadulterated granniness. It is structured like a jazz standard. It starts with a verse, in the jazz sense meaning a standalone intro in free time, and it's followed by a few choruses, also in the jazz sense, in AABA form, jazz. The A section uses the classic jazz chord progression of 1-6-2-5, but with an added flat 6 dominant chord, resolving chromatically up for even more jazzification. And all chords in the A section, except for the tonic, are applied dominant chords, which means they are non-diatonic dominant chords which tonicize other areas of the key rather than the tonic. So jazz. And we don't even have to talk about the instrumentation and arrangement because you know the grannies love it. This song makes it seem like the Beatles tended towards a more authentic granny sound as time went on, but this isn't really true. Because even though they did stay true to Granny with their chord progressions, with their more famous Granny songs, they actually did put a lot of their own spin on it. Although this had to do more with the instrumentation and production style than chord progressions, so this is why these songs are not really mentioned in this list. To most listeners, even those with just a passing understanding with jazz, Honey Pie's chord progression will seem understandable, if even familiar. But the same is not true with the next category, songs with tonal ambiguity. Tonal ambiguity is when the key center is not clear. You're not sure if it's one key or the other, or you just can't pick out a key at all. One reason for this might be lack of context, just like in the song If I Fell. Now, there's already a great video on this by the channel David Bennett Piano, and I recommend checking it out. But to summarize just a part of his video, when the song starts, or when any song starts, we have no tonal context, so the first chord that we hear, we have to just take it as face value. In this case, it's an E-flat minor chord, so of course it could be the tonic of E-flat minor, but it could also be a 2 chord, a 3 chord, a 6 chord, who knows what else it could be. So then this D major chord appears. And this combination of chords does not occur naturally in any major or minor scale, so it confuses the tonal context rather than clarify it. And so as the next 2 chords appear, D flat major and B flat minor, we now have enough information to know that we are in D flat major and that the D major chord is a tritone substitution for the 5 chord in the key of D flat, or it could be borrowed from D-flat Locrian, more on borrowing later. But any sense of security from having finally understood the context is short-lived because within a few bars we're already modulating to a new key. And speaking of lack of security, I am the walrus. So we've just seen how the tonal center can be confused when there's just one borrowed chord and a lack of context, but what happens when there are multiple borrowed chords? So modal borrowing is when you use a chord from a different mode or scale than the one that is your tonal center. So an easy example is if you're in C major, if you use chords like E flat or A flat, you're probably borrowing from C minor. So in the first 3 bars of I Am the Walrus, there are 5 chords and 3 of them are borrowed. Or is it 2? So just like in If I Fell, as the song begins, our default assumption is that the first chord we hear is going to be the tonic. And in this case, the first chord we hear is a B major. If that is the case, then the A6 and G chord are borrowed from B minor, and the F chord is borrowed from Locrian. But by the time we reach the E chord, it kind of feels like a tonic, doesn't it? So if E is the tonic, then that means that the B is the 5 chord, the A is the 4 chord, the G is borrowed from minor, and the F chord is borrowed from Phrygian. So already there are a lot of factors adding up to create tonal ambiguity. First, like any song, there's the lack of context. Second, we're borrowing from several modes within one phrase. We're also using parallel chord types. In this case, all the chords are major, which of course doesn't occur in any major or minor scale. And just like If I Fell, again, we're already modulating very quickly to a new key, probably. So you would think that this is about as harmonically complicated as it would get, but there is one strange oddity from way earlier in their discography that I think is worth mentioning. Money, That's What I Want, from their second album way back in 1963. So most of the song is based on this ostinato that outlines an E minor 6 chord, even though there are chord changes happening above it. So the ostinato works perfectly on the E minor and the A7 since they both pretty much contain the same notes. But what about the B7? So let's break it down. So these are the notes of an E minor 6, and these are the notes of a B7. So if we add these all together, they add the E melodic minor scale. So you could use this to impress your theory friends by calling it a B9 flat 13 over E, but I don't think anybody hears it that way, and I don't think that's what this is. We have a E minor ostinato and a B7 chord on top. You can't combine them to name them one thing. Although, another simpler way to put it is probably just extra crunchy. So there's a different approach to Beatles analysis for you. So this whole time we've been talking about chords and chord progressions, while poor old Ringo has been sitting behind the drum set waiting to play like he always does. But I don't know about you, but I can't afford to hire Ringo to play on my songs. So you might want to watch this video to learn how I figured out how to sound like Ringo in the box.